Welcome to Orato World Media. Orato World Media publishes true stories about real people, written and verified by journalists across the globe. In today's session, we sit down with Jane Elliott. Jane Elliott is an internationally known teacher, lecturer, diversity trainer, and recipient of the National Mental Health Association Award for Excellence in Education. She exposes prejudice and bigotry for what it is, an irrational class system based upon purely arbitrary factors. Her mission is one race. Miss Elliott, what circumstances or experiences compelled you to start your work exposing prejudice and bigotry? Was there an exact moment?
All right. What compelled me to do this work? We were living in Waterloo, Iowa, which is about a third Black. And my husband was managing a supermarket in the north end of town, which was the Black section of town. We were being transferred from Waterloo to Fort Dodge. A woman called me. We were going to rent our house because we owned the house. We didn't want it. We didn't want to sell it. We knew we'd be transferred back. So a woman called and said, "Do you rent to coloreds?" And I remember thinking, if we rent this to people of color, these neighbors are not going to have anything to do with us when we get back. I don't dare do that. So I said, "This is an all white neighborhood." And at that instant, I knew what I had done. She said, "Okay, thank you," and hung up. And I knew immediately what I had done. I had defected to the enemy. And at that point, I decided I will never do that again. I will never allow racism to dictate my behaviors again. I was ashamed by that, and I've never forgotten it. And I never will forget it because I went along to get along. And that's all it takes to make racism work. So then the people who owned the store got picketed by the NAACP shortly after that, because it was during the civil rights movement. And because the store was picketed, the people who owned the store, the National Tea Company, closed that store in the Black section where all their customers were Black and moved it across town. So it folded because nobody was going to go across the river to trade in that store. It was a big mistake that National Tea made. So my husband lost his job because the store wasn't doing any business. So we moved back to Riceville. And Martin Luther King, I went back into teaching in Riceville. Martin Luther King Jr. had been one of our heroes of the month in February. And on April 4th of 1968, he was killed by an assassin. Now, that assassin didn't work alone. That assassin had the cooperation of the American government because he had to die. That's all there was to it, because he and Malcolm X were getting too close together. So that the government arranged, without a doubt in my mind, there's not a doubt in my mind, but what the government arranged to have those two people disposed of. Well, he had been one of our heroes of the month in February. And when I realized what had happened, when I came home the night after it happened, I had been in school all day, and my sister called and said, when I walked in the door, the telephone was ringing. Answered the telephone, and my sister said, is your television on?" I said, "No." She said, "You better turn it on." I said, "Why?" "Because they killed him." I said, "Who do we shoot this time?" Because we were in a shooting mood at that time. And she said, "Martin Luther King Jr." And everything stopped for me in that moment. Everything, the world stopped spinning for that moment, because Martin Luther King Jr. had represented for me all the hope that there is. And for me, hope is an acronym for holding on to positive energy. And that's what Martin Luther King Jr. did. I was just flabbergasted. So I turned on the television, and here was this idiocy going on. So I washed and ironed the teepee that I had brought home that my previous third graders had made. I got the kids fed, sent them to bed, laid that teepee out on the living room floor, was ironing it, looked at the television, and there was Walter Cronkite saying to the three leaders of the Black community, the night after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, saying to three leaders of the Black community, when our leader was killed, his widow held us together. Who's going to keep your people in line? And I thought, my God, did he really say that? Does he really think that JFK was the leader only of white people? And we're so, a young white woman is so strong that she can hold this country together. And these are your people. And I had thought up until that moment that people of color were my people, because we're all members of the family of man, according to my faith. I was just furious. So I changed the channel. And there was Dan Rather saying to two leaders of the Black community, "Don't you Negroes think you should feel sympathy for us white people, because we can't feel the anger at this killing that you Negroes can." Good God, how could you not feel anger at the killing of another person? I was furious. So I rolled up the teepee, I threw it into the closet, because the next morning I decided at that moment that the next morning when we learned the Sioux Indian prayer, because we were studying the Indian unit, when we learned the Sioux Indian prayer, which says, "Oh, Great Spirit, keep me from ever judging a man until I've walked a mile in his moccasins," I was going to arrange to have my all-white third graders in that all-Christian community walk in the shoes of a child of color for a day. I decided at that moment that I would do what Adolf Hitler did. I would separate my students according to the color of their eyes. One of the ways you got sent into the gas chamber during the Holocaust was by having the wrong color eyes. If you had brown eyes, they thought you must be a Jewish person who was trying to pass, and they threw you into the gas chamber. I decided that the next morning I would treat my students positively or negatively on the basis of the color of their eyes. I will never forget the moment when Walter Cronkite said, when our leader was killed, good God, Walter Cronkite, up until that moment, I thought God looked like Walter Cronkite. I was wrong. Walter Cronkite had no resemblance whatsoever to a higher spirit, higher power. That was the most shocking moment I have ever lived through, and I'll never forget it. I wish I could. Because every time somebody mentions it to me, I tear up again because it is such a horrendous thing that we did. That's the moment I decided, and I didn't know what I was doing. Make no mistake about this. My husband came home. He worked at an industrial plant 25 miles from home, and he came home at 11:30 or something. And he walked in the house and he put his arms around me. He said, "They shot him, didn't they?" I said, "Yes, they did." He said, "What are you going to do, Jane?" And I told him what I was going to do, and he said, "You'll lose your job." I said, "If I lose my job for doing the right thing, I don't want to teach in Riceville." He said, "We need the money. These kids need to be fed and housed. You better think this over." Because you see, my husband rode back and forth to work with males from that community. And he knew the kinds of things they were saying on the way home when they heard about the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't hear those things. I was born and raised in Riceville. I was sure people in Riceville would feel the same way as I did about the killing of that man. He was right, and I.
Thank you. Please tell us more about the blue eyes, brown eyes exercise you created in your classroom.
What I do is create an exercise in racism. What I do is create a microcosm of society in a third grade classroom or in a boardroom or in a lecture hall. I separate people according to the color of their eyes. I treat the people who have the wrong color eyes as we treat people of color in this country all day, every day. I run the exercise for about an hour and a half to 2 hours, for as long as they can stand it. And many melanemic people, I use melanemic instead of white whenever I can, because if you don't have enough iron in your blood, you're called anemic. If you don't have enough melanin in your blood to protect yourselves from the damaging rays of the sun, you must be melanemic. It makes no sense to call people white and black. Those are polar opposites. White in the dictionary is the color of purity and goodness. Black in the dictionary is the color of savagery and evil. We've got to stop calling people white and black, because we have divided ourselves. We have created a chasm between people which you can't get across it if you continue to think that I'm all right because I'm white and you really lack because you're black. We've got to put a stop to this. I didn't realize how racist I was. I walked into my classroom the next morning. I separated my students according to the color of their eyes. I am blue-eyed, so I put blue-eyed people on the bottom the first day because I didn't want the power structure to be with the people on top. With the power. I didn't want the I have a large dog here who keeps trying to lick my arm, and it's my daughter's dog. Anyway, people on the top the first day were brown-eyed because I had blue eyes. It was the most absolutely terrifying thing I have ever experienced, because I watched my students. After I told them, first thing I did was tell them, blue-eyed people, we talked about this. We talked about the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. And I finally said to the kids, "Do you have any idea what it would feel like to be black or something other than white in this country?" No, they didn't. I said, "Well, would you like to do something today that will help you know that?" That sounded like fun. Most of the things I did in my classroom were fun. I said, "Okay, we'll separate people. Then how would we separate?" And we discussed it. And they finally decided eye color would work. So I said, "Okay, all you blue-eyed people, move your desk to the back of the room. You brown-eyed people, come to the front of the room." So they did it very joyously. Why not? They didn't know what was coming. And that when we got all settled, and after we had done the first things you have to do first thing in the morning, which is say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag with the words "under God" in it, which do not belong there, and I want removed just as soon as possible. I said, all right, now we all know that blue-eyed people aren't as smart as brown-eyed people. They aren't as clean as brown-eyed people. They aren't as civilized as brown-eyed people. And at that moment, Little brown-eyed Debbie sitting in the front row looked up at me and said, how come you're the teacher here if you got them blue eyes? And I thought, oh my God, there it is. There it is. This kid no longer has to respect me because she knows that she has power over me because of the amount of a chemical in their eyes. What have I done? And what have we done? At that moment, blue-eyed Ellen Moss in the back row stood up and said, if she didn't have them blue eyes, she'd be the principal or the superintendent. They're both brown-eyed. He didn't know what color the superintendent and the principal's eyes were. It didn't matter. He was going to go along to get along, but he was going to align himself with both sides, both the blue eyes and the brown eyes. He was going to see to it that he wouldn't receive the kind of treatment I was. It was just absolutely amazing. I couldn't believe what happened that year. I didn't know. I honestly didn't know. And I think most of us melanemic people don't know about the effect that racism has on people in this country, in any country where you practice discriminating against people on the basis of your ignorance about skin color. Now, it's not about skin color. It's about ignorance. We are all members of the same race. And the people who have come up with the idea of several different races, you need to know that the word race, meaning belonging to a different group because of race, is an idea, that word came out of France in 1580. 1580, you see, this hasn't been going on since the beginning of time. This has only been going on since the Spanish Inquisition. At that time, Torquemada and company were going around trying to convert people, Christians, to Catholicism. But they killed a bunch of Christians before they realized that you can't tell what a person's religion is by looking at them. And at that time, they decided that instead of killing people on the basis of their religion, they would kill people on the basis of skin color. And they came up with white and black. People need to realize that we have been grossly misled, but it hasn't been going on forever and started in the late 1400s. The kinds of things that happened that day shocked me to my core. I had 4 dyslexic boys in my classroom that year. All 4 of them were brown-eyed. On the day those brown-eyed boys were on the top in that exercise, they read words I knew they couldn't read, and they spelled words I knew they couldn't spell. And at the end of the day, brown-eyed Billy Thompson came up to my desk and said, Mrs. Elliott, where's my spelling paper? I said, what do you want it for, Billy? He said, I want to take it home and show it to my mother. She thinks I can't spell, and I can. And he started crying, so did I, because he had been led to believe from kindergarten to the end of 3rd grade that he couldn't spell because teachers didn't know how to teach him properly. We didn't know how to teach the dyslexic child. And I was just sick at what that kid had been experiencing, because the level at which he performed on the day he had the right color eyes was the level at which he should have been performing every day of the year, every day of his life. I was just shocked and offended and disgusted. But on the other hand, I had in my classroom that year, Carol, the Lutheran minister's daughter, tall, blue-eyed, pale-faced, blonde, perfect so-called American girl, came into my classroom in February, reading at the 6th grade level. She had never learned how to multiply. I taught her how to multiply in the first 15 minutes of math class. The first day she was in my classroom, she never made a mistake in multiplication again until the day she had the wrong color eyes. And on that day, that tall, brilliant, absolutely brilliant little girl walked with her shoulders hunched as if to ward off an expected blow. She stumbled when she crossed the classroom. She made mistakes in reading. She made mistakes in spelling, and she forgot how to multiply. Now, the only thing that had changed for her was I told her she was inferior because of the color of her eyes. Now, if I could do that with a child, a brilliant child, in one day, think what we have done to people of color in this country and in many other countries for the last over 200 years in this country. We have to put a stop to this. And if you haven't read the book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, get that book today and read it. Read that book just as soon as you possibly can, because one of the things you're going to find out immediately is 4,000 years. Now think of that number, 4,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, which means 6,000 years ago, people in the Nile Valley, and the Nile River is in Egypt, and Egypt is a country in Africa. It is not in the Middle East. We call it Middle East because we don't want to admit that all those wonderful things we got from the Egyptians came from people of color. Read that book. The first thing you learn is 4,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, people in the Nile Valley were doing cataract surgery with metal instruments before there was ever such a thing heard of or tried in Asia or Europe or the Americas. Did you know that? And if you didn't know that, why didn't you know that? Do you have any idea of how much talent and ability and ambition and creativity we have lost because we refuse to admit that people who are of a different color aren't as smart as we so-called white people, which are melanemic people, are? It's time to realize what we have given up, what we have sacrificed in the name of ignorance. It's pure ignorance that treat people differently because we think that skin color is an indication of race. It is not. We all came from a country in Africa. And if every one of us would trace our DNA back as far as we could, we would find out that a percentage of our DNA came from a country in Africa, because we are all members of the same race, the human race. And I just, oh my God, how have we done this, and how have we gotten away with it, and how long are we going to keep doing it? It isn't just educators who do it. You need to read the book, Rich Thanks to Racism. I'm reading that book right now. And on the way to Waterloo in the way to Iowa City, to take my granddaughter's dogs back to her house in Iowa City, I was reading this book, Rich Thanks to Racism. And I found out why judges do the things they do, why teachers do the things they do, things that I had sensed and I had realized, but I'd never seen it in writing before. Everybody has to read that book, Rich Thanks.
And how did that first exercise grow into what you do today across the country? Why do you continue to do this work?
I told a friend of mine what I had done because I was so shocked. I told my mother first that night. And she said, after I described what had happened, she said, Jane, you better be careful. You don't want to end up where Aunt Eunice did. I said, where did Aunt Eunice end up? In the mental institution. Because what I said, what I was describing, sounded insane. Because it is insane to treat people positively or negatively on the basis of your misperception about skin color. Well, my students wrote 4-paragraph compositions after it was over, telling each child how to tell. On Monday, we reversed the exercise. And that's something I have to tell you about. On Monday, the same kids, brown-eyed kids who had succeeded marvelously on Friday, could not read or spell on Monday because I told them they couldn't. And the girl who had the absolutely ugly experience as a result of having the wrong color eyes, interestingly enough, didn't get even with those who had abused her on Friday. And on Tuesday, on Monday, the kids had to write a 4-paragraph composition telling who Martin Luther King Jr. was, how the child felt on Friday, how the child felt on Monday, and what discrimination is. When they had finished writing on Tuesday, we got in the magic circle, and I said to those kids, when you blue-eyed boys were in the boys' room, you said you were going to get even with the brownies when you got on top. You didn't get even. You were much nicer to them than they had been to you. Why didn't you get even? And that year and every year after that, those kids who had been on the bottom the first day said, we found out how it feels to be treated that way, and we didn't want to make anybody feel the way we felt the day we were on the bottom. Now, the major fear among white people in the United States is, so-called white people, when people of color get power, they're going to want to do to us what we have done to them. My third graders didn't want to get even. They wanted to get equity. They wanted to get back to normal. I think that's what people of color in this country want to do. They want to get what the Constitution promises them, except for the part in the Constitution that says that people of color are only three-fifths of a person. Number one, we've changed that, but it was there originally. We need to realize that, and we need to stop being afraid of what's going to happen in the future if we change this situation. I think we're going to have to lose that fear and realize that people of color are smarter and more compassionate and more empathetic than we melanemic people are. We have never had to be compassionate or empathetic. We have been allowed to be domineering, arrogant, disgusting examples of people who talk religion and who think they are followers of Jesus Christ and who instead have no idea what it takes to be a Christian. We do with Christianity just what we melanemic people do with everything else. One of the major differences between people of color and colorless people, between melanemic people and melanaceous people, is when people of when colorless people come into a new environment, they immediately adjust the environment to fit their needs. When people of color come into a new environment, they immediately adjust their needs to fit the environment. We melanemic people have adjusted even the Bible to fit our needs. We have changed a man who, according to the Bible, had feet of bronze and kinky woolly hair into a light brown haired man with light color eyes, with pale skin. We are able to adjust the environment to fit our needs. We need to wake up to that fact and stop trying to create a higher power, to create a God who looks like us. This is ridiculous. We have to put a stop to this nonsense. The thing after that, the teachers all stopped speaking to me unless they had something nasty to say. Most of my relatives refused to admit that they were related to me. My children were beaten and spit on and abused verbally, physically, and by their teachers psychologically, to the point where we had to move our kids into a different school because the junior high, one of the teachers at the junior high, whose husband was the principal in the elementary building, stopped me at a teachers meeting late in the year and said, "Jane, you've got to get your kids out of this school." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because these teachers are trying to destroy your children."
Wow.
It was extremely interesting. And so we moved immediately after she said that summer. We moved to Osage and got the kids into a different school, but I kept on teaching there. So you see, they hadn't solved their problem. I was still teaching there. I was the problem. My kids weren't the problem. I was the problem. I was still teaching there, and the teachers couldn't bother me because I'd been through it all. I had 3 years of their ignorance, and I was perfectly able to do what my father told me to do. Keep smiling, then son, I will wonder what you're up to. So I kept smiling and singing and walking through. I kept smiling and singing and walking through the halls and pretending that I didn't notice what was going on. And eventually, I didn't notice what was going on. I was busy teaching, and they were busy complaining about how I taught. It was interesting. It was, if I could do anything over, I would wait until I got the kids out of that school before I did the exercise. But the immediacy of the exercise, at that time, we had to do it that day in order for those kids to understand why Martin Luther King Jr. was protesting. And after they went through the exercise, suddenly they knew why Martin Luther King Jr. was protesting. They knew that nobody should have to put up with what he put up with, and those blue-eyed kids shouldn't have had to put up with what they did, nor the brown-eyed kids when they were on the bottom. That's a choice we make. We choose to be or not to be racist. Nobody's born a racist. There is no gene for racism. Though that is a learned response. Anything you learn, you can unlearn. It's time for us to unlearn our racism.
What was the point where your work suddenly went national?
The reason this got on television, the reason I'm doing this is because I showed those essays that my students wrote the day after the exercise was over to a friend of mine. She sent them to the Johnny Carson show. He got on the Johnny Carson show. Think about this. See, the whole thing becomes totally ridiculous. 2 weeks before the Johnny Carson show called me, he had a man on who had shot a Coke machine because it didn't give him his proper change. And he had somebody on who trained chickens and ducks and turkeys or something. And he called me and asked me if I would come in and do the Johnny Carson show. The secretary called my room and said, "Miss Elliott, there's a telephone call for you. You need to come down to the office." So I went down to the office here, and I said, "Well, it's probably correct Scott King," to the kids, because my kids had written letters of condolence to her about the loss of her husband. So we were quite certain that Martin Luther King's wife would be on the telephone. And it was Johnny Carson. So I said to the people, they had turned on the intercom, and I said to my third graders over the intercom, "Kids, it's Johnny Carson." They said, "Who's Johnny Carson?" And I thought that was delightful because Johnny Carson had to hear these little third graders say, "Who's Johnny Carson?" He wasn't nearly as important or well known to them as Coretta Scott King was. So they asked me to do the Johnny Carson show. So my husband and I went into New York to do the Johnny Carson show. 30% of the letters that they got as a result of me being on that show were so vicious and so ugly and so nasty that I couldn't show them to my students. They would not have appreciated the kinds of names that I got called because of that exercise. Now, the whole thing, that was 53 years ago. The whole thing should have died of a natural death. And if it hadn't been right, it would have. But last week, I got a letter from somebody calling me. He said, I am a person who can't understand normal thinking. Now, if you make an acronym out of that, can't understand normal thinking, you know what he was calling me. Now,
Yeah.
I wasn't particularly disturbed by being called that name, but I was impressed that he knew what an acronym was. I'm not sure he knew what an acronym was, but it was a rather interesting use of that word, wasn't it? He didn't have to call me the name. He could call me names that made an acronym. That's what's been happening. And last year, 53 years ago, I was on the Johnny Carson show. And then last year, I was on one of those night shows that was held, Jimmy Fallon show, and it was held in the Johnny Carson show studio. And I thought, well, here I am, 53 years later, still doing the same thing because things haven't changed. They were changing in good shape. I thought we were making progress. When Barack Obama was elected, I thought, now things are better. I'll never have to do this exercise again. And then along comes Donosaurus T. Rump. And here we are, right back to where we were in the late 50s and early 60s. That's how quickly you can slide backward. We have got to nail down the idea of one race. There's only one race of people on the face of the earth, and we're all members of that race. And if you don't believe that, you need to get the book Sapiens by a man whose last name is Harari, Harari. The problem with racism in the United States of America is we don't recognize that we are racist until you read a book that tells you the truth. In this country, the ignorance where racism is concerned is self-imposed ignorance. We could learn these things if we chose to. We choose not to. And we are reinforced in our decision not to learn the damage of racism by the people who are members of ALEC. And if you don't know what ALEC is, capital A, capital L, capital E, capital C, get the book today. Racism, thanks to Rich, thanks to racism. Get that book and read about ALEC and read about the fact that the people who run the major corporations in this country make a great deal of money off of racism. And that's the reason we have racism in this country today, because it is an extremely profitable exercise, and we run it 24/7 in this country. And at the same time that we're denying that we're doing it. But get the book, Rich, thanks to racism. Rich, thanks to racism. I'll have to say that 3 or 4 times, because when you have a product to sell, the people who might buy it won't buy it until they've seen the advertisement at least 4 times. So I'll keep on telling you, read the book, Rich, thanks to racism, until you get that into your head, and then you go get that book. And then you'll learn things about charter schools and about ALEC and about the medical profession and about the law profession that you don't want to know, because it's easier to remain ignorant. You won't be upset by the stuff that you see going on around you if you don't read that book and get it.
Have there been moments where you felt unsafe or you were personally targeted?
Yes, I've been personally targeted a lot. Well, number one, the teachers constantly targeted me, and I knew it, so I just ignored it. But I'd had to give a speech in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, to a group of teachers. And so in the morning, the person who hired me said, could we do the exercise with the teachers? I said, absolutely. So in a very, very limited and informal way, we ran about 400 teachers in Uniontown, Pennsylvania through the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise. In the middle of the exercise, somebody brought up a piece of paper, a folded piece of paper with a bunch of garbage on it and a chewed piece of gum. And on it, it said, this is what this is all about. This meeting is garbage. Well, that wasn't bad enough. Then I had to work with students in the afternoon. And they called the superintendent, the teachers called the superintendent of the schools and said, if you don't get that bitch out of town, we're going to shoot her. Now, the people in Uniontown, 3 carloads of blacks the next night, because I had to work with kids all the next day. And that night, when I worked with the last group of kids, I was being escorted back to my hotel by 3 carloads of black people. And they let me out in my hotel, and they said, one of them got out and said, now, let me into the room. And he said, now, when we come after you in the morning, do not open this door until you see my face Don't look out the window. Look through the peephole in the door, and don't open this door until you see my face in that hole. I said, okay. So the next morning, a car pulled up in front of the motel, parallel, not heading in, but parallel. And the front door and the back door were open of the car. And he got out and he came in and he knocked on the door. I let him in. He pushed me against the wall. He said, now, when I open this door, you go out and you run and get into that car, get into the front seat of that car. You run and get into that car. I said, oh, okay. So he opened the door. I ran and got into the car. He shut the door and he got into the back seat of the car. And 3 carloads of blacks followed us, two in front of us, two behind us and 1 in front of us, and took us to the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Anna S. Cunningham was driving the car, and she was head of the Human Rights Division in Pennsylvania at that time. Got us to the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and then they turned around and went back, and I said, okay, now what's going on here? And then she told me, your life has been threatened, and we've got to get you out of town. They kill people in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. So they she raced me to Uniontown, to Hartford. We got to Hartford, and I did a program in Hartford the next morning. And then that night, she left to go back to her office. And the next morning, I got up and opened the door to my room and looked out. And here I was at the end of a court, and it was a 2-story motel. And here were all these windows and doors, glass doors above that thing, two floors of them. And I thought behind one of those windows could be the person who was sent here to kill me. And I shut the door, and I remember it as if it had happened yesterday. I thought, now, Jane, you've got a decision to make. You can stand here and be terrified and never do this work again, or you can screw your courage to the sticking point and walk out to the checkout desk and go home. What are you going to do? And I had 4 children and a husband who loved me waiting for me at home. And I knew what could happen if I made a mistake. So I took my luggage, the handle of my luggage cart in my right hand. I put my purse over my left shoulder. I opened that door and I walked quickly. I didn't run, because I don't think you run because you're scared. I think you're scared because you run. I think the minute you start to run, the adrenaline starts to move, and then you get scared. I wasn't about to let him scare me. So I walked quickly to the desk, and I got there and I thought, well, you damn dummy, look what you just did. You just allowed them to scare you nearly to death. This will never happen to me again. And every time I go on a college campus now, there are always those 3 little boys with those red caps on that say, make America hate again. It says make America great again, but it means make America hate again. And they're talking about me, and they're doing this with their hand. They're making their little hand signal. And I stop what I'm saying, and I say, listen, fellas, I know exactly what you're talking about. You'd like to see me dead because of what I'm doing to attempt to eliminate or lessen the degree of racism in this country. You can go ahead and kill me. That's all right. I won't mind. My husband is gone. My oldest son is gone. I'll be where they are. And my other 3 kids will be in good shape. And some of them sometimes probably wish I had passed on to my dubious reward. However, you need to realize that, because I'm not an easy person to live with. I said, you need to realize that if you kill me because of what I'm doing to decrease the level of racism in this country, you might make a martyr out of me, and you might have to spend the rest of your life celebrating Jane Elliott Day once a year. Now, do you want that? They'd all do, no. I say, fine, now shut up and listen while I'm talking. And they shut up and listen because they're afraid not to. But as I say those things to them, the young blacks in the males turn and look at them. And now those 3 guys have been identified as being what they really are. And before I finish my remarks, they get over the backs of their seats, run down the aisle, and get out of the building as fast as they can, because they know that they've been identified, and they know they're going to have to live with the consequences of their behaviors. Now, I'll never forget the woman I was at a meeting, giving a speech in, I believe, Houston, University of Houston, maybe 1,500 people in the room. And Sarah was with me at that time. And there was a woman, probably a little younger than I am, but everybody's a little younger than I am, stood up. I had said to the group, well, all the people in this room who consider themselves members of the white race, please stand. All these white kids bounce up, and they're so proud to be able to say that. Say, now remain where you are. Now will all the black students, now the brown, now the yellow, now the red. Got them all on their feet. And I said, now, will every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the human race, please sit down. There's an audible gasp in the room, and they sit down, and then they look at each other, and they start to talk about, what did she just do to us? I said, there it is. You are all members of the same race. Get over it. And at that point, this woman stood up and said, I'm afraid that when they get power, they're going to want to do to us what we have done to them. I said, that's your major fear, isn't it? If people of color get power, they're going to treat you the way you have treated them in the future. Is that right? She said, yes, that's what I'm afraid of. I said, well, let's find out if you're right. So I said to this group, well, every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the Black race and who wants to get even with all white folks, please stand. 3 young Black males stood. The rest of them just turned and looked at him like, are you nuts? And I said, see, they don't want to get even with all of us. Are you more comfortable now? And she said, I think I am. I said, good. I want you to be comfortable, but let's be honest about this. Well, every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the Black race, who wants to get even with 1 or 2 white people, please stand. Everyone in the group, every one of those kids jumped up, cheering and laughing and high-fiving one another. They were absolutely delighted. I said, now, are you still comfortable? She said, well, no, I'm not. I said, you're still afraid that they're going to get even with you in the future, aren't you? She said, yes, I am. I said, here's the solution for that. In the present, treat people the way you want to be treated. No, treat people the way they want to be treated. Be fair to other people in the present so that you aren't one of the 1 or 2 they want to get even with. Does that make sense to you? And she said, well, I think so. And I said to the students of color, does that make sense to you? And they all cheered and laughed and high-fived one another again. Folks, you need to realize people of color don't want to get even. They want to get equity. They want to be seen as truly functioning human beings who are as they have as much right to respect and to be seen as responsible as melanemic people have. We've got to get over the idea that skin color is an indicator of intelligence or of your worth as a human being or of your ability to act like a sane, civilized individual. The way we treat people of color in this country is neither sane nor civilized because it is based on a lie. And the idea of several different races is a lie. It's a flat out lie. And if you think I'm making that up, then those of you who are doubtful, get this magazine, the National Geographic magazine for April of 2018. You see these 2 girls? I suspect that their father is Black and their mother is white, according to our color designation. In fact, the father is melanaceous and the mother is melanemic. This girl is melanemic. This girl is melanaceous. Would you call these girls biracial? Some of you would call them biracial. They are not biracial. There's only one race on the face of the earth. Both of their parents are members of the same race, the human race. We've got to get over words like biracial. It is a total lie. Now, if you don't understand why I'm excited about this, why I'm angry about this, why I'm damn tired of this, and I'm damn tired of it, and I'm a melanemic person, it shouldn't bother me at all. I've got the world by the tail on a downhill pull. But you need to realize that those of us who have the world by the tail are taking hold of the wrong end of the critter. Now, here is a map. Well, would you agree with that? Here is a map that shows where, in 2 waves, those people from this continent traveled to populate every landmass on the face of the earth, including this one. Every person on the face of the earth came from right there. People need to get this magazine, enlarge this map, have it laminated, and hang it on the wall so that people would realize that here is where we all came from. I argued with a young Asian woman, one woman from Japan, at my daughter's house a couple of years ago. And she said, wait, we came from Peking Man. I said, no, you didn't. By the time Homo sapiens had gotten across Earth, all those other hominids were gone. All those other sort of human types were gone. We are all descendants of those first Homo sapiens. She said, well, I don't believe that. I said, okay, here's what you need to do. Go home, trace your DNA back as far as you can trace it, and then call me and let me know what you found out. I got a letter from her 2 weeks later saying, I traced my DNA back as far as I could go, and I found out that my family members many years ago were the first Afro-Asians in my land. Thank you very much. Made my day. It would make your day if you could find that out. And if every person, here's another thing, every person who considers himself or herself melanemic need to realize that only 15 to 18% of the population of the earth is classified white. Now think about that. 85% of the population of the earth is other than white. We have been in the minority forever. The only reason I have the color skin I have is because my ancient ancestors out of Africa moved from Africa into what became Ireland. And as they moved farther and farther from the equator, their skin, their hair, and their eyes got lighter. That's the only reason I have this color skin. You need to realize that there is no such thing as a white race. We are all shades of brown, faded people, dark brown people who faded as they moved farther and farther from the equator. Our race didn't change. Our intelligence didn't change. Well, in some cases, our intelligence did change because we had a leader for the last 4 years who obviously wasn't real bright. You need to know that. And yet he said, I'm a genius. I'm a genius. Everybody knows that. And if my father had heard him say that, he'd say, well, if he was half as smart as he thinks he is, he'd be twice as smart as he is. Now, genius is about 100. Yeah, genius is about 140 IQ. Half that smart would be 70. But if that's twice as smart as he really is, that means he had an IQ of about 35 points. People need to realize when somebody says to you, I'm a genius, you know, you need to say to them, if you were half as smart as you think you are, you'd be twice as smart as you are. Because nobody with any brains claims to be a genius. Geniuses don't do that. They don't have to. People recognize genius when they see it and when they hear it. And you can't just tell people you're brilliant. You have to prove it.
And where do we go from here? Is this problem solvable?
You need to realize what we're working with isn't stupidity. You can't fix stupid. What we are working with is self-imposed ignorance. You fix ignorance by educating people. I'm an educator. The word educator comes from the root ductus, which means lead, the prefix e, which means out, the suffix ate, which means the act of, and the suffix or, which means one who does. An educator is one who is engaged in the act of leading people out of ignorance. Now, what we have to do is educate people, but the first thing you have to do is educate the educators. Go to my website, and a woman named, and I'll never remember, Judith Katz, gave me permission to use materials from her book. The book that she wrote is called White Awareness. White Awareness by Judith Katz. Go to my website, download the printed learning materials. The first page, the first 3 pages, is a set of typical statements that white folks make that think they aren't racist. Here is a set of those typical statements. For instance, on the whole, the educated, the upper classes, the emotionally mature, and the deeply religious are much less racist. Now, that's what we melanemic people say. You need to realize that that assumes that racism is an individual matter rather than one of all whites who take advantage of the benefits of a white racist dominated society. You can get well educated. You can spend a lot of time in school if you never argue with the racist teaching. If you just go along to get along, you can get really well educated. They have done studies in this country that prove that the longer you stay in school, the more bigoted you become, because the longer you're in school, the longer you are reinforced in what you learn grades K through 12. Because what we learn in grades K through 12, particularly in social studies, is anti-social studies. We teach that Columbus discovered America. You can't believe that after you read the book, The Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. You can't go along with that any longer when you realize that those people of color left the equator and populated every landmass on the face of the earth. You won't go along with that anymore. And in order to stop going along with that, you have to get a copy of the Peters projection map. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the map of the world on which it shows Greenland hanging down there like a great big ripe plum in the middle of that map. Greenland isn't that big and Africa isn't that small. Africa is 14 times the size of Greenland. We're talking about the Mercator projection map. And on the bottom of the Mercator projection map, there is a legend. And the last sentence in the legend says, South America is actually 9 times larger than Greenland. Now you get a copy of the Mercator projection map and see how much bigger Greenland is than South America. It's a lie. And according to the social studies teachers, the equator is a line halfway between the North Pole and the South Pole. On the Mercator projection map, it's 2/3 of the way down the map, so that you can't even call the northern part of that map the northern hemisphere, because hemi means half. Take a look at that map, and if the northern part of that map isn't half of the globe, then get rid of that map. there is a better way. This is called the Peters projection map. Look at the size of Greenland on this map and look at the size of South America and of Africa. And there's no legend on the bottom of this map that says South America is actually 9 times larger than Greenland. We have done a really bad job of educating people. Also, in that set of typical statements, you'll find the typical statements. You'll also find the clarifications of those statements, why you ought not to be saying them. And you'll also find a set of commitments to combat racism. 18 things you can do in your own environment to change your own racism. Now somebody's going to say, well, racism is a societal problem. No, societies are made up of individuals. And if enough individuals, enough of us say to ourselves, we're going to turn off television if there are no commercials with people of color in them. Now, when television first came out, and in fact, until the last 5 years, all the commercials showed people of importance in those commercials as if they were indeed melanemic. Now you see people of all colors in those television commercials because the people who are running the show know that if they want to have customers in the future, if they want customers to buy their product, they're going to have to appeal to something other than melanemic people. It's absolutely amazing if you just compare today's commercials to yesterday's commercials. And everybody watches television.
It's happening now.
So it's a great place to see what kind of progress we've been making. We can make a difference if each one of us decides to take just one action out of those 18, choose one, circle it, go through it, check yes or no, whether you have or haven't done it, then go back and check one, circle one that you check no, put the date beside it, and do it for a month. You'll find out at the end of the month, you've made a whole lot of people angry and you've lost some friends. And they aren't really your friends anyway, if they can't agree that there's something wrong with what we're doing in this country. And then choose and make some notes about what you learned, and then choose another one that you checked no. We can change our own attitudes. You're not born a racist. You're not born a sexist. You're not born an ageist. You're not born an ethnocentrist. Those are things, and you're not born homophobic. Those are things you have to be carefully taught. And we know how to teach them because we do it in the schools all day, every day, at the same time that we're saying, I pledge allegiance to the flag under God. There are a lot of students in schools today, and there were when I was young, that don't believe in God, or that don't use the word God to talk about the supreme being. We need to realize that putting those two words in the pledge was absolutely unacceptable behavior. For years, we had laws, we had separation of church and state. That is getting less and less prominent now because of the rise of the evangelical Christian movement. If you don't understand what that's all about, you need to get the book Crazy for God or Angry with God, either one of them, written by Frank Schaeffer. Get those two books and read them. And you'll realize that we have even inserted Christianity and expecting people to take on Christian beliefs in the military. Or get the book, The Family by Jeff Charlotte. The Family, or there's another one. He wrote 2 books, The Family and, well, just look up Jeff Charlotte. I'm sorry, it isn't the dog, it's my daughter. Get the book, The Family, and read it, and it will blow you away when you realize that the laws that are being written today are because some of those people have been in Washington, D.C., and C Street is the name of the other book.
That's it.
And they can rent property on C Street. They can rent houses or condos on C Street if they agree to take lessons in evangelical Christianity.
And The Family is on Netflix in 5 series.
You need to read The Family, and you need to read C Street, and you need to read and understand why our laws are being written the way they are. Now, you also need to get the book, The Color of Law. Oh, good Lord. I read that 5 or 6 years ago. It blew me away. Get the book, The Color of Law, and read it. If you don't want to read the whole thing, I think you read pages 217 and 218 and read all the things that could have been different if our legislators and our lawyers hadn't been trained to think in certain ways about skin color. You think, my God, what have we done? What we have done is, instead of educating people, we have been indoctrinating people. We've got to stop the indoctrination and start the education.
Where does one get more information and tools to help combat racism?
Yeah, just go to Jane at janeelliott.com and download the typical statements, the clarifications of the statements, the commitments to combat racism, and the bibliography. And read everything on the bibliography under racism. Because now some people are going to say, well, what about homophobia? Look, folks, you need to realize that we base our treatment of those who are different in other ways on how we treat people who are of a different color. We use that as the standard by which we can judge and how we can treat all others. We know that we get away with abusing people because of the color of their skin, and we know exactly how to do it. We use those techniques for how we treat others who are different in other ways. Think about that and realize that if we could get rid of racism, we wouldn't have any way to decide how to treat people. We'd have to treat people fairly. If we treated people of color, if we treated melanemic, melanaceous, and melanotic people fairly, if we treated them equitably, we would do away with racism, and pretty soon we would do away with all the rest of these, because none of them make any sense, any more sense than racism does. It is, you want a definition for an ignorant person, just call them a racist. Because only ignorant people remain racist. And it's self-imposed racism because the information is out there. If I could learn it, you can learn it, and so can everyone else. And let me tell you, most people of color know what's happening, but they don't understand how it works or why it works. And many children of color think that it's true that they aren't as good as, which is the reason we have little boys who have what their mothers call black skin, trying to bleach. They're using Hylex on their skins to try to bleach themselves so that they can have the right color skin. We've got to get rid of this, and we've got to do it now.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been Jane Elliott on Orato World Media Interviews. For the full Jane Elliott article, please go to orato.world. We thank you for watching, and we encourage you to like, subscribe, and share our page.